So again, we're in Acts 2, 41 to 47. Last week, we looked at the first sermon in the church. So now it's appropriate to look at the first church, and that would be the First Baptist Church of Jerusalem. Now, some may take issue with calling it a Baptist church, but in my opinion, if you're going to baptize 3,000 people on day one, like you can kind of be like, we'll just call them a Baptist church then. And then there's quite a bit to cover in these verses, so let's see what Luke unpacks for us about the establishment and characteristics of this first church. So we start in verse 41 with the conversions on day one of the first church. So then, those who had received his word were baptized, and that day there were added about 3,000 souls. So we see here a picture of believing in the gospel. To believe in the gospel is to receive the testimony of Christ that was given to you. And to receive it means you welcome it, you believe it, it is true, and you desire the work of Christ for you. It is yours because you have received it. So there's numerous places in the New Testament where belief is described. An equivalent term for that is receiving the gospel that is given to you. The gospel is a gift. And so when you believe it, you're accepting, you're receiving that gift that is given to you. Next, we see that those who received the gospel were baptized. This would clearly be baptism by immersion because up until this point, baptism was only done by immersion as far as we know in even other cultures or religious settings where it happened. It wasn't until later in the early church where the church changed to the pouring baptism that many do today. One of the interesting things in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, one of the exhibits in the Israel Museum is the oldest intact Christian baptismal pool. So they have the oldest archaeology discovery of a baptismal pool that was created by the church. A few interesting things about it. One, that it was found in the Jerusalem area. So obviously, they had been baptizing enough people that they had established a church that they're like, we got to make our own place to baptize people. Second, it specifically says on the exhibit that it was made on a size to immerse people. And then the third is that the way they immersed people back then, the size of it was a tank that was probably about waist deep. And you would immerse someone, they believe, based on the way it's, built and constructed, that you just bend forward, dip your head in, and then bend back up. So our dipping somebody back and pulling them up, we don't know when they added that in, but probably the earliest baptisms were just you'd bend forward at the waist and then come back up. So I have said to people before, like if you get super nervous and don't want to tip back, you can bend forward. That was how they did it before. Like we don't need to do the going backwards. I think when we baptized Alonzo, and I baptized him that way, he just bent forward and put his face in the water. But that was how it was originally done. As far as how we can tell based on archaeology that it would have gone back to. Obviously, they did not have their own pools available at that time. So we read here that 3,000 people were baptized at that day. And that's an insane number, and it would take a long time to baptize 3,000 people at one location. But one thing we need to remember is that in Jerusalem at that time period, there were many common baths throughout the city of Jerusalem. So there were multiple places that you could go in order to baptize people in the city of Jerusalem. Jesus did some miracles at a couple of those pools in the city of Jerusalem. Some of them are still there today. You can visit them, obviously, as at sites today. If you ever were to walk down the Hezekiah Tunnel in Jerusalem, that empties out at the Pool of Siloam, so you can go in that even today. And it's funny that we people want to be baptized in the Jordan River because that's where Jesus was baptized. But you could just baptize people right there in the little pool at the end of Hezekiah's Tunnel, which is probably where the first Christians were actually baptized in one of the places. So most likely what you had were probably the 12 disciples splitting up those 3,000 some people into groups of 250 to 300, taking them to different locations throughout the city and baptizing there. which would make the baptism of 3,000 people still large groups of a couple hundred people, but nothing obscene, like that's a reasonable number of people that could be baptized. So the significance of baptism at this time period, though, was that baptism served as a formal way that someone would enter into a new community. So the most common reason someone would have been baptized up to this period of time would be a Gentile who said, I want to be a Jew. Like, I want everybody from here on out to mark me as a Jew. I'm going to live according to Judaism. I'm going to follow their eating regulations, their dress regulations. I want to be considered a Jew. So it was your public proclamation to say, I want to enter the Jewish community. And so I think we should continue to view baptism the same way today in the church, where baptism is your public proclamation to say, I want to join this group of followers of Jesus Christ. So these 3,000 people were getting baptized to say, yesterday we didn't believe in Jesus, but now today we do. And we want to join with the community of those who are witnesses of Jesus Christ. And I'm not at all shocked that 3,000 people would get saved on day one in the church. In fact, it's a number that I expect. And if anything, I'd be like, maybe it should be higher. And the reason I say this is that we need to remember what happened before the first day of the church. And that is, before the first day of the church, we had Jesus doing ministry for 3 years. Jesus was healing people. He was casting out demons. He was feeding the 5,000. He was teaching with the greatest of skill. So on this day of Pentecost, why are 3,000 people able to believe on day one? Because Jesus was priming the pump for all of this for years. So the fields were white to harvest that day. Why? Because Jesus was sowing for multiple years, and now his disciples were reaping the rewards, which should remind us today that if you feel like you're somebody who's sowing the seed, sharing the gospel with people, you're witnessing, you're being kind and gracious, even when people are really rude to you, and you're not seeing a lot of fruit from it, it doesn't appear to be effective. You need to always remember that maybe God just has somebody else coming along behind you who's going to reap that reward and reap that harvest. We know that we'll both receive the treasures in heaven for eternity for that. But even Jesus, when he left and ascended to glory, there were 120 people there in the room. But then his disciples reaped that harvest later on. And so we should expect the same thing to happen if we are faithful to the Lord today, that even if we don't see the benefit right before us with people, so exciting to hear somebody say, oh, I believe Jesus for the first time. But even if we don't get to see that, we trust that our work will still be able to lay up that fruit for a future day. So day one of the church, you basically is made up of Peter preaching, and then you have 3,000 people receiving the gospel through faith. The good news of salvation comes to all those people. And then they basically, I imagine it had to have happened where they would have split up into multiple smaller groups, and 3,000 people are baptized in pools scattered throughout the city of Jerusalem. Now, what I think the way it reads is the rest of the chapter probably covers what would be the first week or the first several weeks of the church in Jerusalem. So we get sort of the elements of what the church is like after day one. And in verse 42, we read, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. So before we get into what they did when they came together, one thing I want to point out is that I believe it's very appropriate to call them a church from day one, even if the narrative in the Bible doesn't call them a church immediately. And you can call them a church because the word church just simply means an assembly. So the Greek word for church just means anytime a group of people gather together for a singular purpose, that's a church. There's even one point where a mob comes together, and that mob is called a church. So just coming together as a group of people is that Greek word for church. So as soon as they began to assemble together, starting with Pentecost and going on, they were a church. Every time they met after that, they're meeting as the church. And when they met together as the church, we read that they did 4 things together. And I believe continual devoting should be used to apply to all four of these actions. So they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, continually devoting themselves to fellowship, continually devoting themselves to breaking of bread, and continually devoting themselves to prayer. So let's talk about what these would be. First, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. You have to think that probably the bulk of this is listening to stories of Jesus, hearing about what Jesus did. This is probably the disciples also passing on all the discipleship lessons that Jesus had taught them in first the Sermon on the Mount early on in their ministry in the Gospel of Matthew, and then you have the lessons that they learned in the upper room right before the death of Jesus Christ. Probably Jesus, they were probably also like, and there's one time there were, Jesus called out 70 of us, and he split us up by twos to go into the various towns, and here are the instructions Jesus gave us before we went out into those towns. So they were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching by studying their own words, which then today for us turns into the gospel accounts that we have today. And so whenever we study the gospel accounts, we're following what they're doing. And based on Peter's first sermon, and also based on what we find in the epistles, I'm going to guess that a lot of the apostles' teaching is going to be them tying Jesus and his ministry to the Old Testament. So they're going to have a lot of foundation in the Old Testament, showing the continuity, the continuous of the narrative that's going from the Old Testament into the New. So for us today, the apostles' teaching would be our New Testament, or even more so, our studying the Bible. So when we come together, we should, if we want to be like them, continually devoting ourselves to the study of the Word of God. The second thing we read that they were doing is they were fellowshipping. This is the Greek word koinonia. Koinonia comes up many times in Paul's letter. The word koinonia basically means to be united together. And we can have fellowship together not only as individuals who enjoy and encourage and build each other up in company in that we have together, but it should also be a unity around a common purpose and a common viewpoint, which is the gospel and sharing the gospel. And we're told that throughout in multiple places that the key to having that fellowship, that koinonia, is through the Holy Spirit as he dwells in us. So to be together is to have a unified vision that I believe would be in the context of seeing Jesus as our God and Savior, learning about what Jesus has taught us himself. And so it's just basically a being united in Christ together with a singular focus. The third thing that they did all the time was breaking of bread. This is typically limited to the Lord's Supper when a lot of people teach this today, also known as communion. But I have a hard time limiting this to communion or the Lord's Supper, because breaking of bread is just simply a phrase that meant to eat together. So the Lord's Supper could certainly be included to this, but I would say one of the interesting things is that if someone wanted to say, well, this breaking of bread refers to the Lord's Supper, what we should also be then saying is that if you're going to say that, then when you have the Lord's Supper, it should be part of a larger whole meal. And so when you celebrate the Lord's Supper, you should do it as a full meal eating together. So I'm more convinced, just looking at this terminology a little bit, that the main point was that when they were gathering together, they were eating meals together. And those meals may have included the Lord's Supper. I'm sure they did on many occasions. But it's more specifically talking about how they met together and ate these meals and enjoyed fellowship together around food. So when we meet together as a church, and maybe this is something we should incorporate even more when we come together, is we should eat food together. We should commune around the table. And then the final point is prayer. They gathered together to pray in community. I don't know about you, but me personally, I find it easier to pray in public with other Christians than I do in private. When I'm praying with the whole church, like, it is just easier to be more focused on my prayer and what I'm saying. Like I've talked to a lot of people about this, you're praying alone and you get just a little bit into it and your mind starts thinking about this and thinking about that and you lose track of what you're praying about. And I find it much easier to stay focused on praying when I'm with other believers in Jesus Christ. I like listening to what they say to help guide me in my prayer. So I just enjoy praying in community. And I think we should all embrace praying together. I believe praying corporately as a church at the beginning of each week should be what kickstarts us toward praying privately throughout the week. And so I think it's important to have these times when we gather together on prayer. This is one of the things I like so much about Wednesday when we come together, whether it's 2 people or 8 of us. I love that we can come together and spend that time and devote ourselves toward praying together as a church. So those are the 4 things they did when they gathered together as a body of Christ. We want to hope that our church is going to reflect all of those when we come together as a assembly, as a church. And then verse 43 describes what I'd say the nature of the early church. We read, everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many signs, and wonders were taking place through the apostles. So the early church we read here was in awe over the work of the apostle. This word awe is the word phobos in the Greek. Phobos is the word that we get in English for our phobias. It's the word for fear. So we read, honestly, like a straight reading of this is they were afraid of the apostles because of what the apostles were able to do. Like the miracles brought fear of them before the apostles, which then also communicates to me that there's probably something fundamentally different about the way that they were practicing miracles in the way that we see them, practiced in many churches today that claim to do them. I think the way that the early church spread in the first few years was just incredible. Like it was mind-blowing how the church spread in those first few years. No one could have seen it coming. I think the spread of the early church only makes sense if the first apostles were able to have these unique miracle expressions that caused fear and awe into the converts over the power of God. So to me, this is one of those other little nuggets where I look at this fear of the church over the miracles and the wonders of the apostles to say, what was going on then is not the standard. Like this was something unique that happened in that time period. And in the same way that like Moses brought fear into the Israelites during the wilderness wandering because of the relationship he had with God and the things that he was able to do, I think we see the same type of thing happening here with the start of the church that we saw with the start of Israel. So it's a sort of unique expression of miracles that took place during that time period. While I still believe God can work and does in miraculous means, I think this empowering of specific individuals to regularly do these signs and wonders is something that was for the establishment of the church and not the norm. And I think you see the impact of that ability to do that with how quickly the church spread throughout the Roman Empire in those early years. But it was a gift unique for that time. And now we come to what are obviously the most controversial verses about the early church. Verses 44 and 45, where some people use it to say that the early church was communist. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. So what we see here, I think, is pretty simple as what is going on. But it has been used by some to argue that the early church, early Christians were based in the same type of political philosophy and theory as communism, which I think is a little ridiculous. But I think what we see here is what I would call sharing on steroids. But while steroids are an unhealthy supplement, this is a very healthy supplement brought about by the power of the Holy Spirit. So what we're seeing here is that as Christians had need, so this wasn't a universal requirement. This wasn't something that people automatically had to do. But whenever there was a need, you saw that the Christians, that the church would give sacrificially and abundantly to meet that need, to the point where you would have many people who were selling their property and their possessions to meet the needs of others. What we don't see in these verses is Peter going and like preaching a sermon where he's like, okay, here's what's going to happen. Now that we're gathering together and we're followers of Jesus Christ, we know that the day of his return is fast approaching. So here's what I need all of you to do. I need everybody to sell their homes, sell all their possessions, and I need to come and put your money at our feet. Like Matthew, like tax collector bro, you're good at doing this. I need you to go and make sure that you're gathering everybody's money and bringing it all into one pot, making sure everybody's selling their homes so that we can have all of everyone's possessions together owned by the church. I don't believe that was what was happening at all. Instead, what it appears to be is someone would have a need of some sort, and the church would say, all right, we got to meet that need. Like, we got to help these people have a home, have food, whatever it is that they need. And then somebody would say, well, I have this piece of property that I could sell. Somebody else would be like, well, I have these oils or ointments that I could sell. And they'd sell those things and bring the money together in order to meet the need of that person in the church. So this is not a top-down enforcement policy that everyone is required to sell all that they have and to give their funds to a central governor. There are two reasons we know explicitly that this is not what happens. One is in this very passage. It's actually in the very next verse. In verse 46, we will read that they shared meals from house to house. So if I were to get up on Sunday morning and if I were to announce, okay, we're going to start a new program here in our church, we're going to have everybody take turns feeding the church, and a different night of the week, we're going to go and eat at different people's houses. So Monday night is Badia night, Tuesday night is Ritter night, Wednesday night is Cobb night, and we're going to go from house to house to house, eating meals at everybody's house. We're not going to drive across the river or the lake, so you guys are out. We'll stay over here. You guys are going to need to do the driving if you want to share in this meal. But if I were to say we're going to have meals from house to house, the assumption is the people in our church would own those houses. We would have those houses. So if they sold all of their homes and property, you wouldn't be able to have verse 46, where they were sharing meals from house to house. And then on top of that, we have the story of Ananias and Sapphira. In Acts chapter 5, we have Ananias and Sapphira coming together. They lie about the selling of their property. In fact, it's such a weird, even kind of petty way to lie about it, because they actually did sell it, but they gave part of the money to the church and held part of it off for themselves. What's weird is it's like you're selling your property and then giving part of the money to the church. Shouldn't that be enough that a boys for you? To give a portion of it to the church? But they wanted people to think that they were giving all of it to the church. And Peter's response to them when they lie this way in Acts 5:4 was to say, while it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? In other words, Peter's saying nobody's making you sell your house. I'm not coming up behind you and forcing you to sell it and give us all the money. It was yours. You could have sold it and kept all the money, and nobody would have said anything. Or you could have not sold it and continued to use it for other means. And so Peter's saying nobody's making you do this. So why did you think this was a good idea? So in other words, what was not happening in Acts chapter 2 was a communist-style, top-down governance where everybody was forced to sell their own property and give it to the community and entrust some central planner in the community to decide who would receive what, who would get what. That isn't what we see happening. Instead, what we see happening here is something that should be a conviction and a rebuke to us. Because what we see is Christians who, when there's a need, they're like, I'm going to sacrifice from what I have to meet the need of someone else. If I have to sell some property that I own, that I'm sure I was holding on for something important for my family later on, to meet that need, I'm going to sell that property. I'm going to sell garments I have in my closet. I'm going to sell oil and food that I have, and I'm going to be able to bring that money in order to meet the needs of others. So this is just sort of should be a rebuke for all of us, that we need to not only give based on our excess or our top 10% or however people want to view it, but we need to be willing to give sacrificially, even if that is having a yard sale to bring about extra cash to give it to someone else in a time of need. And one of the hard parts in the church today is also Christians should be encouraged when they are in times of need to express that need to the church. Because I think one problem we also have in America today is our American need for self-sufficiency. And I got to make sure that I pay my own bills. So I'm going to go into massive debt to cover something that I have that needs to be paid for, instead of ask the church to help me with this need and deliver me in this time so I don't need to go into all of this debt. And so we can encourage people to express and share needs that they have, but then also be willing to help people when they are in need. One thing I love telling people, that when they come to the church and they ask for cash, like this is strangers that come to church, knock on the door, ring the doorbell, and ask for cash. And I always tell them the same thing. Like I always say, like, we don't give cash to people we don't know. Like, I got food I can give you. I got diapers I can give you if you have a baby. I don't give cash to people I don't know. But here's what I do know. And that is, if you got to know us and we got to know you and we developed a friendship together, I know there are people in this church, once they were your friends, they would be pulling out their wallets without me even needing to prod them and ask them to be able to help give you cash. So if you really need money, well, the way to get that money is to become friends with us. And because I've seen it time and time again in this church where people have had financial needs, and then somebody else in the church is, has that person in the corner who has that financial need so that they can help them and give them money that they need to pay that rent or to have that food that they need. And so, or to cover that cost for that copay. I've seen it happen again and again and again. People in our church giving to those who are in need. So I can always boldly say to people who are asking for money, if you have that need, just come be a part of us and we will help you through that. We just can't, give cash to every person who rings the doorbell. But if you want help, come, befriend of the church, and we'll be willing to help those who are in need. So what we see about the early church so far is, one, they were people who were believing in Jesus Christ. They desired to be marked as part of that community by being baptized into it. Then they would devote themselves. They would meet together regularly so that they could fellowship together, eat together, spend time in the Word. And then one part of that fellowship is when a need would come up, people would sacrificially give in order to meet that need. And then we end with sort of one kind of final summary statement that sort of wraps up the chapter and description of the early church in verses 46 to 47. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. So I was thinking, if I could describe this first church of Jerusalem at its founding with any one term, like one or two terms, like what are the words that I would use to say, here is the overarching character of this first church? I think I ended up settling on there's two words I think I'd have to use to describe this church. They were kind and they were evangelistic. So they were kind, they were defined by their kindness and their evangelism. And I think you could then go even further to say that they're just defined by their kindness. Because what's the greatest way to show kindness with someone who is an unbeliever? And that is to share the gospel with them. So if you're being kind to those who aren't saved, you're going to let them know about Jesus Christ. So I think the most basic character trait of any church is that these people they're kind. They're gracious. They will help those who are around them. One interesting note is that the early church clearly met in two different types of location. And we've already talked about how they would meet house to house and share those meals together. So they would meet in people's homes. But the second place that they would meet is they would meet in the temple. Paul, in his evangelistic journeys, in his missionary journeys, would end up meeting in the synagogues of towns until the synagogues would end up kicking him out shortly thereafter. And I think part of the reason probably why they met in the temple and then the synagogue early on is that I imagine that if I was in the early church, I would have expected that the Jewish people in large would end up believing the gospel. Like, I'm testifying that our Messiah came and he rose from the dead, and we've done these miracles to show it, and Jesus did these miracles. I would expect them to end up believing. That those at the temple who go to worship there would end up believing in Jesus. Those who are at the synagogue would end up believing in Jesus. So I think for them it was probably just logical to meet at the temple because you would expect all the temple people to end up believing. You'd go and meet at the synagogue because you'd expect all those synagogue people to end up believing. But sadly, that's not what ended up happening. And one thing we need to remember about the meeting at the temple is that the temple structure was huge. Like, the temple was massive. So you not only would have like the main center temple area that we think of where they would have the holy place and the sacrifices, but around the temple there was this giant courtyard and then porticos which had all these rooms in it where people could meet for study of the Torah. So there were lots of places on the temple compound where you could meet and have these early church services to talk about Jesus Christ. So they'd meet in temples, they meet in the synagogues. They would also meet in homes. Luke emphasizes once again here that they were meeting and they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart. And I wonder if the way that it was phrased here in verses 46 and 47 when they were talking about having these meals together, if there was any chance that Luke knew about the problems going on in the church of Corinth, and he might have been speaking to them with the way that he worded this in the book of Acts. Because what I find interesting is that Luke uses here both the breaking of bread and sharing of food. If you remember what happened in the church of Corinth and the problem that they had meeting together is that they would meet to break bread and to eat meals together. But what would happen? They weren't sharing the food. Like one person would have so much, they'd be like, oh, I'm sick, I ate too much, or I'm drunk because I drank too much. They'd have somebody else farther down the room who was like starving because their meal was the same as our communion meal. Like, they'd eat a piece of dry cracker bread and they'd drink a little sip of water down wine, and that's it. So there was no sharing. So I almost felt while I was reading this that this idea of putting together breaking of bread and then the sharing of meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, this does have the idea of you're sharing all the food together. So I wonder if the timing of when this was written versus what was going on in Corinth, if Luke might have been kind of rebuking the church of Corinth to say, this is what's supposed to happen when you meet together. That is, you are supposed to share food together, which then shows us that what is one of the fundamental characteristics of the early church? Potluck meals. So if you are being like the early church, you're having potluck meals. So when we have the buffet table and everybody brings their food and it's all delicious together, that's us living out the early church and bringing it here to River Ridge, Louisiana. So that's a fundamental characteristic with the potluck meal. So we read here also that they praised God. And I would be curious to know what Luke had in mind when he said they were having favor with all the people. It's interesting in the context that Luke wrote this, because having favor with all the people, what very shortly thereafter happened with the people that were around them? They persecuted them. They hated them. They stoned them. So I'm trying to think about what this would mean, like knowing that they were having favor with all the people, yet there were a certain portion of the people that wanted to imprison them and kill them. And I wonder if this was in some way saying that regardless of how the Jews in Jerusalem responded to them, they were going to live in such a way that they were going to have grace and favor toward everybody of that city. So putting it in context, it might be something along the lines of, regardless of how they were being treated, they were going to treat everybody else with favor. Like we're not going to reserve our kindness only for the church, but we're going to show favor and grace to all of the outsiders, even to those who persecute us and mock us and say evil things about us. So it's this idea of having a goal that we're going to love other people who are outside of us to such a degree that we could be described as having favor with all of the people around us. So basically, we don't want to be hypocrites in the church where we say we're about kindness, but really live in such a way that we clearly are not. So you have the first church in Jerusalem. There's the description there. And man, it is pretty rosy. Like it sounds great. Like I would love to be part of that first church in Jerusalem. It sounds so ideal. But as I say that, I want to make sure that we're also very clear to say there is no way these early ideal conditions in Jerusalem could last. Why could the ideal conditions not last? Because the church is filled with people like us. And what are we all like? We're all fallible. Like we're all people who could get a heart of a flame for evangelism, but then it ends up drifting away when a certain number of people reject us, and it just breaks our heart that people tell us that they don't want to believe. We could have divisions over leadership, divisions over what standards now to have for this community as we bring it together. And I say this to just remind everybody that while things looked great in the early church, we're going to see some problems that they're going to have really quick. To remind ourselves to say that our hope should never be in getting back to the early days of the church. Our hope should never be in cleaning up the church enough so that we can live in such a way that we're just this wonderful community together. But our hope always must be in one thing, and that is the return of Jesus Christ. Our hope must always look to Jesus and not what we can do when we gather together, how we can serve each other, how we can serve the community. We want to do all those things. Like we want to be that outreach, but we don't want that to be our hope. We don't want to be obsessive about getting back to these early days because they would end up having the same problems in the church in Jerusalem with the disciples there. They're going to have other issues and other churches as we're going to go through this book. But our goal must always be, our hope must always be Jesus Christ and him coming back in all of his glory.